The professor stopped his lecture and asked why the human wasn't taking notes. That was the moment the entire class learned she had written the research being taught. Professor Krovac stood at the front of Lecture Hall 7, all four of his arms gesturing wildly as he explained the finer points of quantum entanglement across dimensional barriers. His scales shimmered under the fluorescent lighting, a sign that he was particularly excited about today's material. And why wouldn't he be? This was advanced stuff, the kind of content that separated the merely competent students from the truly brilliant ones. "Pay attention, class," he announced, his voice booming through the auditorium. "What I am about to teach you represents the cutting edge of our understanding of multidimensional particle behavior. This material will not be in your standard textbooks. You will need to record everything I say." Around the lecture hall, approximately 40 students immediately activated their recording devices. Holographic displays flickered to life. Datapads hummed with energy. Fixnar, the crystalline student in the third row, actually split off a small fragment of himself to create a backup recording system. That is how important this lecture was supposed to be. But then there was the human. Olivia Chen sat in the middle section, row 12, seat 8. Her hands were folded casually on her desk. No recording device, no datapad, no holographic display, not even one of those primitive paper notebooks that humans sometimes insisted on using for their bizarre nostalgic reasons. She just sat there, looking mildly interested, like someone watching a rerun of a show they had already seen 5 times before. Krelovac continued his lecture, diving deep into the mathematical proofs that supported quantum tunneling theory. The probability wave function, as you can see here, collapses at a rate proportional to the observer's dimensional anchor point, divided by the Heisenberg constant to the 4th power. The other students scribbled frantically. Qualmix, who existed primarily as a sentient gas cloud, was vibrating so intensely with concentration that his containment field kept flickering. Brendor, the insectoid in the front row, was taking notes with 6 appendages simultaneously. And Olivia Chen, she yawned. Actually yawned. Krelovac felt his secondary heart skip a beat. Was this human seriously so disrespectful? He had heard the rumors, of course. Humans were supposed to be clever, adaptable, surprisingly innovative despite their short lifespans and soft, fragile bodies. But this was just arrogance. He continued teaching, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. She was not even pretending to pay attention anymore. She had pulled out some kind of small device and was looking at it under her desk. Was she checking messages? Playing games? The audacity was staggering. "Miss Chen," Krelovac said, interrupting his own explanation of dimensional coefficients, "perhaps you would care to explain to the class why you feel my lecture is not worth recording." The room went silent. 40 pairs of alien eyes, sensors, and various other perceptual organs turned to look at the human. Fixner's crystalline structure actually made a small chiming sound of shock. This was not done. "You did not call out students like this unless you were prepared for a confrontation." Olivia looked up from her device, seemingly surprised that she was being addressed. "Oh," she said, tucking the device away. "I already know this material, Professor. I did not think I needed to take notes on it." Several students gasped. Brendor's mandibles clicked together in disbelief. Krelovac felt his scales flush red with irritation. "You already know this material? This lecture represents 15 years of cutting-edge research in quantum mechanics. I have not even published these findings yet in the major journals. And you, a first-cycle student, claim to already know it." "Well," Olivia said, her tone remaining annoyingly calm, "I would not say I am a first-cycle student exactly. But yes, I am familiar with the content." Krelovac felt all 4 of his hands curl into fists. In his 3 decades of teaching at the Galactic Confederation University, he had encountered many types of difficult students. The overconfident ones who thought they knew everything. The lazy ones who wanted passing grades without effort. The cheaters who tried to smuggle quantum computers into examinations. But this casual dismissal of his life's work, this bordered on insulting. Familiar with the content, he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm that could have melted through hull plating. "How wonderfully convenient for you, Miss Chen. Tell me, did this familiarity come to you in a dream? Perhaps the quantum fields whispered their secrets directly into your auditory receptors." A few students made nervous sounds that approximated laughter. Fexnar chimed softly. Qualmix's gas cloud contracted slightly, a sign of acute discomfort among his species. Olivia, however, did not look uncomfortable at all. She simply shrugged. A peculiar human gesture that Krelovac had learned meant something between indifference and acceptance. "If you would like, Professor, I can recite back everything you have said so far in this lecture, word for word. I can also provide the mathematical proofs, the experimental data that supports your conclusions, and the 3 alternative theories that other researchers have proposed to explain the same phenomena. The classroom went so quiet you could have heard a photon drop. Brendor's antennae shot straight up in shock. She cannot be serious, he chittered to the student next to him. Nobody can memorize complex quantum equations after hearing them once. That is impossible. I do not think she means she memorized them just now, Kolmix whispered, his gaseous form pulsing with confusion. I think she means she already knew them before class started. Thixnar's crystalline body refracted light in sharp skeptical angles. That makes even less sense. How could she know unpublished research? Krolovax held up one hand for silence. His eyes, both the primary and secondary sets, focused intently on the human. This was either the most elaborate bluff he had ever witnessed, or something very strange was happening here. Either way, he would not allow this challenge to his authority go unanswered. Very well, Miss Chen, he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Since you claim such comprehensive knowledge, I will give you an opportunity to prove it. Come to the front of the class. You will have 10 minutes to explain the material I have covered in the last hour. Every equation, every proof, every experimental reference. If you fail, if you stumble, if you cannot provide the complete and accurate information, you will formally apologize to this class for wasting everyone's time, and you will accept a formal academic reprimand on your permanent record. He crossed all 4 arms across his chest, confident that this arrogant human was about to learn a very valuable lesson about humility. Olivia stood up, gathering nothing because she had brought nothing, and walked calmly down the aisle toward the front of the lecture hall. 10 minutes, she asked. That should be more than enough. Olivia Chen reached the front of the lecture hall and turned to face the class with the kind of relaxed confidence that should have been illegal. She did not fidget. She did not hesitate. She simply looked at the 40 stunned alien faces staring back at her and began. The probability wave function and multidimensional quantum entanglement, she started, her voice clear and steady, collapses at a rate proportional to the observer's dimensional anchor point, divided by the Heisenberg constant to the 4th power. The mathematical expression for this relationship is as follows. She walked to the holographic display board and began writing equations without even pausing to think. Her fingers moved across the interface with practiced ease, each symbol appearing in perfect formation. The equation sprawled across the screen, complex and beautiful and absolutely infuriatingly correct. Krovax felt his secondary heart stutter. That was exactly what he had written. Exactly. But Olivia was not finished. Not even close. The experimental verification for this theory, she continued, comes primarily from the Deltaran station experiments conducted in 2341, where researchers observed particle behavior across a controlled dimensional membrane. The error margin was approximately 0.03%, which, while impressive, still left room for alternate interpretations. She turned to face the professor directly. You mentioned this in your lecture, Professor Krovax, but you did not mention the follow-up experiments conducted by the Andromedan Institute in 2343, which reduced that error margin to 0.007%. You also did not mention the competing theory proposed by Dr. Hicks-Larn, which suggests that the collapse rate is not proportional but rather logarithmic under certain specific conditions. Dixnar made a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs. Brendor's 6 note-taking appendages had frozen completely. Qualmix had stopped pulsing altogether, which for his species was the equivalent of holding your breath in shock. Krilovax opened his mouth to interrupt, but Olivia was already moving on to the next section. Regarding quantum tunneling across dimensional barriers, she said, writing another series of equations that filled half the display board. The probability decreases exponentially with barrier thickness, but the relationship is modified by what you called the dimensional anchor coefficient. The formula you provided was accurate for standard 3-dimensional to 4-dimensional transitions. However, it requires adjustment for 5-dimensional transitions and above. The correction factor is approximately 1.47 times the base coefficient, multiplied by the dimensional index -2. She paused, tapping one equation with her finger. This correction factor, by the way, was something I calculated in my own research about 3 years ago. I published it in the Journal of Advanced Quantum Mechanics, Volume 47, Issue 9. You might have seen it. The paper was titled Dimensional Scaling Effects on Quantum Tunneling Probabilities in Higher Order Manifolds. The silence in the room had somehow become even more intense. It was the kind of silence that suggested reality itself was taking a moment to reconsider its life choices. Krelovax felt like his brain was melting. This human, this supposedly first-cycle student, was not just reciting his lecture. She was correcting it. She was expanding on it. She was citing her own published research that apparently predated his current work. The Heisenberg constant relationship, Olivia continued, completely unfazed by the dropped jaws around her, becomes particularly interesting when you factor in observer entanglement states. You touched on this briefly, Professor, but the full mathematical treatment requires a tensor field analysis across no fewer than 7-dimensional axes. I can write out the full derivation if you would like, but it takes about 40 minutes and requires 3 display boards. She turned back to the class. The key experimental data supporting all of this comes from about 15 different research groups across the galaxy. The Deltaran Station experiments I mentioned, the Vraxian Deep Space Observatory, the Human Hadron Super Collider on Europa, the Tellurian Institute's dimensional probe studies. Should I continue listing them, or would you prefer I jump ahead to the practical applications in faster-than-light communication systems? Brendor fainted, just completely lost consciousness and toppled sideways out of his seat. Nobody even moved to help him. Krelovax's scales had gone from red to a pale, sickly green. His primary hands gripped the edge of his desk while his secondary hands hung limply at his sides. He looked like someone who had just watched their entire understanding of the universe get casually dismantled by a creature that barely came up to his chest height. "Stop," he finally managed to croak out. "Just stop talking for a moment." Olivia paused mid-sentence, her hands still hovering over the holographic display where she had been about to write yet another equation that would probably make him question his entire career. "Miss Chen," Krelovax said slowly, carefully, like he was diffusing a bomb made of academic humiliation. "I need you to explain something to me, right now. How exactly do you know all of this? And do not tell me you are just naturally gifted or that humans have amazing memories. I want a real answer." Olivia blinked at him with those strange forward-facing predator eyes that humans had. "I already told you, Professor. I wrote my doctoral thesis on this exact topic." "Well, not this exact topic. My thesis was specifically about dimensional scaling and quantum tunneling, but obviously that required a comprehensive understanding of multidimensional quantum mechanics as a foundation. This is literally my field of expertise." The words hit the classroom like a gravitational anomaly. "Your doctoral thesis," Krelovax repeated flatly. "You, a first-cycle undergraduate student, wrote a doctoral thesis." "Oh," Olivia said, and for the first time she looked slightly uncomfortable. "Right. I see the confusion now. I am not actually a first-cycle student. I am a postdoctoral researcher. I completed my PhD 4 years ago at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on Earth. I have been working in quantum mechanics research ever since." Fixnar made a sound like a crystal glass shattering in slow motion. "Then what?" Krelovax said, his voice climbing towards something that might have been hysteria. "Are you doing in my introductory quantum mechanics course?" "This is a second-year undergraduate class," Olivia sighed, a very human expression of frustration. "Because your university's administrative system does not recognize human academic credentials properly. When I transferred here for the cross-cultural research exchange program, they looked at my transcripts and decided that because I did not take a course specifically called Introduction to Galactic Standard Quantum Theory, I needed to fulfill that requirement. Never mind that I have a doctorate. Never mind that I have published 17 peer-reviewed papers. Never mind that I literally helped to design the quantum communication array on Europa. Apparently none of that counts as equivalent to your second-year intro course." The explanation landed on the class like a meteor strike. Krelovax felt all 4 of his hands start to tremble. "You are telling me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you are a published researcher? With a doctorate? In quantum mechanics? Quantum physics? Technically, but yes. Do you want to see my credentials?" "Yes," Krelovax said immediately. "Yes. I absolutely want to see your credentials right now." Olivia pulled out her datapad, the same device she had been looking at earlier when he thought she was playing games or checking messages. A few taps later, she projected her academic record onto the main display board. The room erupted in chaos. "Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Earth, Bachelor of Science in Physics, graduated with highest honors, Master of Science in Quantum Physics, thesis titled Observer Effects in Nanoscale Quantum Systems, Doctor of Philosophy in Advanced Quantum Mechanics, dissertation titled Dimensional Scaling Effects on Quantum Tunneling Probabilities in Higher Order Manifolds." Below that, a publication list that scrolled for several screens. Journal of Advanced Quantum Mechanics. Physical Review D. Nature. Science. Quantum Information Processing. On and on and on. Krulavax activated his own terminal with shaking hands and pulled up the Galactic Academic Database. He searched for the paper she had mentioned. Volume 47, Issue 9, Journal of Advanced Quantum Mechanics. There it was. Author, Dr. Olivia Chin. Human, Earth, Solar System. Publication date, 3.2 standard years ago. Citation count, 247. He opened the paper. The equations looked familiar. Very familiar. Almost like someone had used them as the basis for a lecture they were planning to give to second-year undergraduate students. I cited your work, Krulvax said, his voice hollow. I used your research in my lecture. I have been teaching from your paper for the last 6 months. I know, Olivia said gently. You did a very good job explaining it, by the way. Very clear. Your students are lucky to have you. Qualmix chose that moment to disperse entirely, his gaseous form spreading across the ceiling in what could only be described as emotional collapse. Let me explain how this absolute catastrophe of administrative incompetence came to be. Because honestly, it is the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that makes you want to throw yourself into a black hole and hope the spaghettification is less painful than dealing with university registration systems. 3 months earlier, Olivia Chen had arrived at Galactic Confederation University as part of the Interspecies Academic Exchange Program. She had been thrilled, actually, the opportunity to study multidimensional physics from alien perspectives, to collaborate with researchers from species that perceived reality in completely different ways, to access experimental data from across the galaxy. It was a dream come true for someone in her field. Then she met with the academic advisor. The advisor, a well-meaning but tragically rule-bound Quellet, named Vextair, had looked at her Earth transcripts with all 3 of his visual sensors and made a series of humming sounds that Olivia would later learn meant this is going to be a problem. Your credentials are very impressive, Dr. Chen, Vextair had said, manipulating his datapad with 4 tentacles simultaneously. However, our system requires all incoming students to complete certain foundational courses to ensure standardization across our diverse student body. I see here that you do not have a course listed as Introduction to Galactic Standard Quantum Theory. That is because Earth does not call it that, Olivia had explained, very patiently. We call it quantum mechanics or quantum physics. It is the same thing. I have a doctorate in it. Yes, but is it Galactic Standard? The math is universal. Physics does not change depending on what you call it. Vextair had made another humming sound, this one meaning I understand your point, but I am going to ignore it because the computer says no. He had tapped several screens on his pad. I am afraid the system is quite clear. Without the specific course title in your transcripts, you must take Introduction to Quantum Mechanics, course code QM20TO, to fulfill your basic science requirement. I have published papers on quantum mechanics. That is wonderful, but not equivalent to the course. I have a doctorate in Earth quantum mechanics, not Galactic Standard. They are the same thing. The computer disagrees, and that right there was how Dr. Olivia Chen, published researcher and expert in her field, ended up sitting in a second-year undergraduate course being taught material she had not only already mastered but had actually contributed to through her own published work. She was not alone in this predicament, either. Somewhere across campus, Dr. James Okonkwo, a xenobiologist with 15 years of field experience studying non-carbon-based lifeforms, was sitting in Introduction to Basic Alien Biology, learning that some aliens did not breathe oxygen. Revolutionary information, truly. In another building, Professor Sarah Nakamura, an astrophysicist who had literally discovered 2 new types of stellar phenomena, was attending Fundamental Space and Celestial Bodies, where she was being taught that stars were big and hot. The human delegation had tried to fight this. They really had. They had submitted appeals, provided documentation, shown their publications and research grants and letters of recommendation from some of the most respected scientists on Earth. They had explained, very carefully and with extensive visual aids, that human academic systems were rigorous and legitimate and produced extremely qualified researchers. The Galactic Confederation University Administration had reviewed all of this documentation thoroughly and carefully. Then they had stamped it with does not meet equivalency standards and told everyone to attend their assigned introductory courses. It builds character, the dean had said. It wastes time, Olivia had replied. Same thing, the dean had insisted. And so here she was, sitting in Professor Krulavax's classroom, being taught her own research by someone who had cited her papers, Because somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of galactic academia, nobody had bothered to check whether quantum mechanics and quantum theory might possibly refer to the same field of study. Professor Krelvax spent approximately 30 seconds staring at Olivia's credentials before his brain rebooted and his sense of academic dignity came roaring back to life. "This is unacceptable," he declared, slamming one hand on his desk while the other three gestured dramatically. "Dr. Chen or not, you are enrolled in this course. You have an obligation to participate appropriately, taking notes, engaging with the material, showing proper respect for the educational process. You cannot simply sit there doing nothing because you think you are too advanced for the class." Olivia crossed her arms, a gesture that among humans apparently meant I am about to dig my heels in and this is going to be annoying for everyone. She looked at the professor with those unsettlingly direct eyes. "Professor Krelvax, with all due respect, I am not here because I need to learn this material. I am here because your administration system has a catastrophic failure in credential recognition. Why should I waste my time taking notes on information I already know, have already published papers about, and frankly could probably teach better than? No offense, you can." Several students gasped. Fixnar's crystalline structure vibrated with scandalized frequency. "Better than I can?" Krelvax's scales flushed deep purple. "That is incredibly arrogant." "Is it arrogant if it is true? I have been researching this specific topic for 7 years. You have been teaching it for what? 6 months. Based on my paper and others like it. I am not trying to be rude, Professor. I am trying to be efficient. I have actual research to conduct. Sitting in this classroom taking notes I do not need is not efficient." Before Krelvax could formulate a response that would adequately express his outrage, the classroom door slid open. Professor Hixlarn, who taught the advanced seminar next door, stuck her elongated head into the room. Her species had exceptional hearing, which meant she had probably caught every word of this disaster. "Krelvax, what is all the shouting about? Some of us are trying to teach actual advanced material to students who, oh my." She stopped mid-sentence, her optical sensors focusing on the display board still showing Olivia's credentials. "Is that Dr. Chen? The Chen who published the dimensional scaling paper? You know her work?" Krelvax asked weakly. "Know it. I assigned it as required reading in my seminar." "Dr. Chen, what are you doing in an introductory course?" "Administrative error," Olivia said tiredly. "The university does not recognize my degree." "That is absurd," Hixlarn said, slithering fully into the room now. Her serpentine body coiled in what her species considered an aggressive academic posture. "Krelvax, why are you wasting this researcher's time?" "I am not wasting anyone's time. She is enrolled in my course. She should be taking notes and participating like everyone else. She wrote the paper you are teaching from." "That does not matter. Academic protocol demands." "Wait, you assigned her paper? In the advanced seminar?" "Obviously. It is one of the most significant recent contributions to the field." The door opened again. This time it was Dean Vorpala, a massive crustacean-like being, who had heard the commotion from 2 floors away. His eye stalk swiveled to take in the scene. The students frozen in shock. The 2 professors clearly in the middle of an argument. The human standing calmly at the front, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. "Someone explain," the dean rumbled. "Why my afternoon has been interrupted." 3 people tried to talk at once. Krelvax insisted this was about respect and protocol. Hixlarn insisted this was about criminal misuse of a qualified researcher. Olivia simply held up her datapad showing her credentials. Dean Vorpahala looked at the display, then at Olivia, then at Krelvax, then back at the display. "You put a postdoctoral researcher," he said slowly, "in a second-year undergraduate course. The system said she needed it." Krelvax protested. "The system," Vorpala said with the kind of patience that suggested he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to academic administration, "is run by a computer that once classified a quellet as a houseplant because they both photosynthesize. Perhaps we should not treat it as infallible, but the rules state clearly that all students must complete foundational courses. She has a doctorate in Earth quantum mechanics. Physics is physics." Qualmix had reconstituted himself just in time to watch this argument escalate. He whispered to Brendor, who had regained consciousness, "Is this normal for human education?" "I think," Brendor chittered back. "This is normal for bureaucracy everywhere." Dean Vorpala held up one massive claw for silence. The arguing stopped immediately, because when a being the size of a small shuttle tells you to be quiet, you listen. He tapped his datapad with surprising delicacy for someone with appendages that could crush steel. "I am going to do something radical," he announced. "I am going to use common sense. Dr. Chen, You are clearly overqualified for this course. Professor Krelvax, you are correct that protocol exists for a reason, but wrong about applying it here. Professor Hixlarn, please stop looking so smug. It is unbecoming. Hixlarn's optical sensors dimmed slightly in what might have been embarrassment. The dean continued, his eye stalks rotating to address the whole room. Here is what we are going to do. First, I am authorizing an immediate credential review for all human exchange participants. Clearly, our equivalency system needs recalibration. Second, Dr. Chen will be allowed to test out of all undergraduate requirements through challenge examinations. Thank you, Olivia said, looking relieved for the first time since this whole mess started. I am not finished, Vorpala said. Third, since you are apparently an expert in multidimensional quantum mechanics, and since Professor Hixlarn seems to think your work is significant, you will be teaching an advanced seminar on dimensional scaling effects starting next week. The room went silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. The kind where everyone's brain is trying to process information that does not quite fit their understanding of how things should work. I am sorry, Olivia said carefully. Did you just say teaching? You came here for cross-cultural academic exchange, correct? Well, exchange goes both ways. You learn from us. We learn from you. You will teach a graduate-level seminar, 1 3-hour session per week. Professor Hixlarn will co-supervise to ensure you understand our academic standard. Consider it part of your exchange program requirements. Hixlarn's whole body brightened. I would be delighted to co-supervise. Dr. Chen, your dimensional scaling work has applications we have barely begun to understand. Having you here to teach it directly would be invaluable. Krelvax looked like he had been struck by lightning. Wait, you are putting her in charge of a graduate seminar? She just arrived here. She does not know our teaching methods. Then perhaps, the dean said mildly, she can teach us some new ones. I have reviewed her publication record while you were all arguing. Dr. Chen has 17 peer-reviewed papers, 3 of which have been cited over 100 times each. She has presented at 6 international conferences. She has supervised 4 graduate students. She clearly knows how to teach. The question is whether we are smart enough to learn from her. That statement hit like a hammer. Because really, what could anyone say to that? The dean had just politely told the entire room that they had been too bureaucratically stupid to recognize an expert standing right in front of them. I will do it, Olivia said, though she still looked slightly stunned. I mean, that is actually why I came here. To share knowledge. To collaborate. I just expected to be doing it in a lab. Not a lecture hall, but sure. I can teach a seminar. Excellent, Vorpala said. Now, Professor Krelvax, since Dr. Chen will need assistance understanding our student population and academic culture, you will serve as her co-lecturer for the first month. Krelvax's scales went through approximately 7 different colors in rapid succession. You want me to co-teach with her, but she just humiliated me in front of my entire class. No, the dean corrected. You humiliated yourself by not checking her credentials before accusing her of arrogance. This is an opportunity to learn from someone whose work you have been citing. I suggest you take it graciously. The dean turned his massive body toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Dr. Chen, do try to take at least minimal notes in your remaining classes until we get this sorted out. Not because you need them, but because watching a professor have an existential crisis mid-lecture is disruptive to the other students. Yes, sir, Olivia said, fighting back a smile. As Vorpala left, the classroom remained frozen. Slowly, very slowly, the students began to process what had just happened. Fixnar was the first to speak, his crystalline voice chiming with excitement. Does this mean we can enroll in her seminar? If you qualify for graduate-level coursework, Hixlarn said. This will not be an easy class. Brendor's antennae perked up. Will she teach us the dimensional scaling corrections? The ones that were not in Professor Krelvax's lecture. I can teach you whatever you want to learn, Olivia said. That is kind of the point of teaching. Professor Krelvax sat down heavily at his desk, all 4 arms hanging limply. His entire worldview had been reorganized in the last 20 minutes and he was not handling it particularly well. Next week, he muttered. I have to co-teach with her next week. Look at it this way, Hixlarn said cheerfully. You will finally understand your own lectures. 1 week later, Lecture Hall 7 looked remarkably similar to how it had before, except for one tiny, incredibly significant detail. The person standing at the front was now a human who barely reached most of the students' shoulder height, and the person sitting in the audience frantically taking notes was a 4-armed reptilian professor, whose scales kept shifting between embarrassed green and reluctant respect purple. Olivia Chen stood at the holographic display board, marker stylus in hand, looking far more comfortable than she had any right to be. Behind her, complex equations sprawled across 3 separate screens. In front of her, 23 graduate students and 5 auditing professors stared with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for watching stars collapse. So the key thing to understand about dimensional scaling, Olivia was saying, her voice carrying easily through the hall, is that it is not linear. Everyone assumes it should be linear because that is how we are trained to think about scaling in 3-dimensional space. If you double the size, you double the volume. Simple math, right? Wrong. When you start adding dimensions, the relationship becomes exponential, then logarithmic, then it does this weird twisty thing that makes most physicists want to cry into their coffee. Several students made sounds of recognition. Thixnar, who had somehow managed to qualify for this graduate seminar despite being an undergraduate, chimed with excitement. But here is the beautiful part, Olivia continued, writing a new equation that somehow looked both elegant and terrifying. Once you map out that weird twisty relationship, you can predict quantum tunneling probabilities across dimensional barriers with incredible accuracy. We are talking error margins under 0.01%. That is the difference between theoretical physics and engineering applications right there. In the third row, Professor Kralovax was taking notes so furiously that his datapad was smoking slightly. All 4 of his hands moved in synchronized desperation, recording every word, every equation, every casual insight that Olivia dropped like they were common knowledge instead of cutting-edge research. Olivia turned to the class, her expression shifting to something more serious. Now, the Deltaran experiments I mentioned last time, the ones from 2341, they were groundbreaking, absolutely revolutionary, but they made one critical error in their methodology. Can anyone tell me what it was? Kolnix pulsed thoughtfully. They did not account for observer dimensional anchoring. Close, Olivia said, pointing at him with the stylus. They accounted for it, but they assumed all observers had equivalent anchoring coefficients. They did not consider that different species might perceive dimensional space differently based on their neurological structures. That is a very human-centric assumption to make, which is ironic because humans were not even part of the research team. She pulled up a new display showing brain scan data from 6 different species. Look at this. A Vraxian perceives 7 dimensions naturally. A human perceives 3, maybe 4 if you count time. A Quellet perceives 12 but only interacts meaningfully with 5. How can you assume that the observer effect is consistent across all these different perceptual frameworks? Professor Hicks Alarn, sitting in the front row and co-supervising as promised, made an appreciative hissing sound. This is exactly the kind of cross-species analysis we have been lacking. Tell me, Dr. Chen, did you develop this comparative framework yourself? Mostly, Olivia admitted. I collaborated with a Vraxian colleague, Dr. Zixanal, for the 7-dimensional perception data. Humans cannot exactly test it ourselves, obviously. We are kind of stuck in our 3-dimensional bubble, evolutionarily speaking. She turned back to the board and began writing another series of equations, but then paused and looked over her shoulder at the class. Oh, and before anyone asks, yes, this will be on the exam. Also, yes, you will need to show your work. Also, yes, I know it is hard. That is why it is a graduate seminar and not an introductory course. That last sentence was delivered with just enough pointed humor that several students glanced at Krulvax, who had the decency to look slightly sheepish. The lecture continued for another 90 minutes. Olivia walked the class through dimensional tensor mathematics, experimental design considerations, and practical applications for faster-than-light communication systems. She answered questions with patience and clarity. She drew diagrams that actually made sense. She even made a few jokes, which was apparently unusual enough in academic settings that the students did not quite know how to respond at first. When the class finally ended, students clustered around the front, asking follow-up questions and requesting clarification on specific points. Olivia handled each inquiry with the ease of someone who had been teaching for years, not days. Krulvax waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. His scales had settled into a resigned blue color that suggested acceptance of uncomfortable truths. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, that was an exceptional lecture. Your explanations were clear, your examples were relevant, and your handling of the dimensional perception variance was something I had never even considered. Thank you, Professor, Olivia said, genuinely pleased. That means a lot coming from someone whose own work has been so influential in the field. There was a pause. Krulvax's scales shifted through several colors before he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind for the last 3 hours. Would it be possible, he said slowly, for me to borrow your notes? For my own reference, of course. To improve my own teaching methods. Olivia's face split into a grin that was absolutely wicked. I am sorry, Professor Krulvax. I did not take any notes during my lecture. I already knew the material. The look on his face was worth every second of sitting through that introductory quantum mechanics class. Then she laughed and pulled out her data pad. I am kidding. Here. I will send you the complete lecture materials, including the supplementary reading list and the experimental data sets. We are colleagues now, right? We should share resources. Krulvax took the data transfer with all four hands, looking at the human with something approaching wonder. You know, he said thoughtfully, when humans first joined the Galactic Confederation, many of us wondered what you would bring to our academic community. I think we are beginning to understand. What is that? Olivia asked, the humbling reminder. Krulvax said, his scales shifting to a warm amber that indicated respect and affection. That intelligence and knowledge are not limited by how long your species has been traveling between stars. Sometimes the newest voice in the room is the one everyone should have been listening to all along. Olivia smiled. That is very diplomatic of you, Professor. Much more diplomatic than how I would have put it. How would you have put it? Maybe check people's credentials before accusing them of not paying attention in class. Krulvax's laugh echoed through the empty lecture hall. And for the first time since this entire disaster began, he felt like maybe, just maybe, having humans in the galactic academic community was going to work out just fine, even if it meant occasionally discovering that the student in your second-year class was more qualified to teach it than you were. Somewhere in the administrative offices, Dean Vorpala received a notification that 17 more human researchers had just been upgraded from undergraduate to graduate status after proper credential review. He looked at the list, looked at the disaster he had narrowly avoided with Dr. Chen, and made a note to himself. Never. He dictated to his recording system, ever trust the automated equivalency system again. Always check credentials manually, especially for humans. They are terrifyingly competent, and we keep accidentally insulting them. It was a lesson the entire university would remember for generations. And in classrooms across campus, human researchers who had been suffering through introductory courses they did not need suddenly found themselves teaching seminars to students who actually wanted to learn from them, sharing knowledge across species barriers, and proving once again that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their adaptability but their absolute refusal to accept bureaucratic nonsense when there was real work to be done. The galaxy, whether it was ready or not, was learning a very important lesson. Never underestimate the human who is not taking notes. She probably wrote the textbook.